my name is Chris. I am one of the educators at the St. Louis Zoo. We're going to get into some ground rules in just a second, but I wanted to introduce myself on camera first. I have my mask here around my neck today with everything that's going on with the coronavirus. We're trying to be safe, but right now it's down around my neck because I don't have anybody in the room with me. I'm at home with my immediate family, so I have my mask on, but it's down around my chin. All right, so we do have a couple of ground rules to get started with. So Connor's going to share the screen so I can talk you through those. If you've been to one of our webinars before, I'm sure you've seen these, but we have to go over them anyway. So first is our community learning standards. So I'll just read through these and I'm sure you guys can all handle our little ground rules. I will be friendly and respectful of others in my interactions in the chat box. And we'll talk more about the chat box in a moment and the Q&A box. I will use the Q&A box for relevant and appropriate questions. And if you haven't done a lot of Zoom webinars before, the Q&A box is usually you can find it down towards the bottom of your screen on a little banner or the top, and it's got two little word bubbles and the letters Q&A beside it. I will use the chat box to respond and interact in regards to the webinar topic. So feel free to share things in that chat box. It's down in the same banner as Q&A, but please be respectful and stick to our topic today. And if you do have questions, it's best to put those in the Q&A so that I can see them and hopefully answer them at the end. I understand that if the moderator of the webinar has asked me to alter my behavior in the chat, I may be removed from the webinar, but I'm sure that's not going to happen today. All right, so please share in the chat box if you can find it where you are from and how many people are watching with you. We like to see where people are tuning in from because we get to reach a different audience than we do at the zoo with these webinars, which is kind of fun. And then find the Q&A box, like I said, if you want to submit questions to me. Some of those Connor might answer for you typing, and some of them I might answer on screen either during or probably more likely after the webinar if we have time. We do have Connor, our tech person behind the scenes, and he's going to be helping out and he might answer your questions or he might respond to you in the chat. And at the end, we'll have a quick enjoyment poll, so please stick around for that and make sure you answer it because we want to know how we're doing. All right, so we'll go back to me and I'm going to share my screen so that you guys can see some of the animals we're going to talk about today. Hopefully you guys can see my screen. So we're going to talk today about some storybook creatures and real life animals that are a lot like them. So I don't know about you guys, but I love to read, and I love to read stories that are kind of fantastical, that maybe have dragons or unicorns or fairies or dwarves or gnomes in them. So what you might not know is there are a lot of real creatures that kind of resemble those. So the first ones we're going to talk about today are unicorns. And I don't know if you guys know that words can kind of be like Legos, and you can put two different words together to make a new meaning. So does anybody know what the word unicorn means from those two pieces? Maybe we'll start with una. What does una mean? And you can put that in the chat, or you can just share with your grown-ups if you're watching. Yep, I see a couple people answering. One, it's kind of like the game Uno, right? Uno means one in Spanish and un in French. So una just means one. Does anybody have any guesses? This one's a little bit trickier. What corn means in the word unicorn? Oh, I see some awesome guesses. You guys are super smart. Oh my gosh. It means horn. That's right. Or sometimes point. So cornucopia is a horn of plenty. You see those at Thanksgiving sometimes. Or a tricorn hat has 3 points on it. So unicorn just means one horn. So we're going to talk about animals that are like that. Now, what else describes a unicorn besides that one horn? What do they look like? Anything you guys know of? Yep, somebody said they look like a horse. Exactly. They usually do in stories look like horses, and usually they have 4 legs, a mane and a tail, hooves, things like that. So those are the kind of characteristics we're going to look at today with our real life animals. So our first animal is a rhinoceros. So I don't know if you guys can see my face on the screen. I'm going to kind of try to show you my shirt. It's got a unicorn on it and it says Save the chubby unicorns. It's my favorite shirt. I absolutely love it. So our first animal that's like a unicorn is a rhinoceros. But one thing you might notice in these pictures is the rhinoceros on the left has one horn, but the ones on the right have two horns. The ones on the right are some of our St. Louis Zoo rhinoceroses. So there are different kinds of rhinos, and some of them, like the one on the left, are the one-horned rhinos. Sometimes they're called Indian rhinos. And the ones on the right are a black rhino, and they have two horns. So technically those guys aren't unicorns, but I wanted to include them anyway because some rhinos have one horn. And just like other unicorns, they have four legs. So they are kind of similar to unicorns. Now we're going to move on to our next animal, which is a narwhal. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of narwhals before, but you could probably see why I picked narwhals. What do they have in common with unicorns? They've got that big one horn coming out of their heads, right? But if you look closely at these pictures, can you see where the horn is coming out? It's not really coming out from their forehead. It's coming out from the front of their face because it's actually a tusk. It's like a long tooth. Yep, somebody says it's a big tooth horn. You guys know so much already. Hopefully you'll still learn some things today. But it sounds like you guys might have some things to teach me. But that's right, it's a tusk. And one thing I forgot to tell you about the rhino horn is that it's a little different than most horns too. It's made entirely of keratin, which is what our hair and our fingernails are made of. And it's just really, really hard keratin on top of their head. Most horns have bone inside them, but rhino horns don't. So you guys are doing a great job. So our next animal that's a little bit like a unicorn is another one of our St. Louis Zoo animals. They're called Speke's gazelles. They're these tiny little gazelles, and I think they are super, super cute. But I think their horns look a lot like a unicorn horn, even though there are two horns on Speke's gazelles. But their bodies and their face shapes look a lot like unicorns to me. They don't have a mane or a fluffy tail, but I think their body shape looks a lot like unicorns. So they've got a lot of similarities too. And one thing that's interesting about the Speke's gazelles is they have these kind of bumpy noses. It's a little hard to tell in the picture, but they can kind of inflate them a little bit. They can swell up their noses. So I think they're super cute too. And the St. Louis Zoo has done a really great job breeding these gazelles to help make sure that we learn more about them and that there are plenty of them for people to see at the zoos and to kind of contribute to their species. All right, so we're going to have our first poll next. So think about those animals that we just talked about and which one do you think is the most like a unicorn to you? There's no right or wrong answers here. I just want to see what you guys think. And the answers when the poll comes up are in the same order as these pictures. On the top is the gazelle, which starts with G. I know we have some audience members today who might not be quite reading long words yet. So the second answer is the rhinoceros, which is in the middle. It starts with R. And the bottom answer is narwhal, which starts with N. So you guys get to choose which one you would pick. And when most people have answered, I will close or Connor will close the poll and we'll show you guys the results. All right, so most people picked narwhal. That doesn't surprise me. They're a really popular animal and they're really cool. And I don't at least know that much about them because they're kind of rare and elusive. All right, next we are going to go on to our next fantastical creature, which are dragons, another one of my favorites. So what describes a dragon? Something that makes a dragon? It could be what it looks like or what it can do. Tell me in the chat what you think. All right, somebody says breathes fire, or at least fire. That's right. Oh, and somebody in the chat said they couldn't choose for the poll. That's totally okay too. I have a hard time deciding. All right, somebody said breathe fire. Yep, you might want to think about what they look like, what kind of bodies they have or skin they have. Somebody says they have scales. Perfect. And a tail, and somebody said wings. You might notice in my picture that the dragon on the right doesn't have any wings. So in some cultures and stories, dragons don't actually have wings. This is an Asian image of a dragon, and sometimes they can fly, but they don't have wings. But a lot of stories have dragons with wings. And somebody said they're a reptile and they have claws. These are all awesome answers. Perfect. All right, so now we're going to talk about the real animals that look like dragons. The first one even has dragon in the name. You might have expected this one. It's called a bearded dragon. And we do have these at the zoo, but the really cool thing is you can have a dragon as a pet. Bearded dragons actually can be pets. You have to make sure that your home and your family is right for a bearded dragon because they do require some extra care. But if you wanted a dragon for a pet, you could have one. Somebody on the playground might not believe you if you said that, and you could say, yes, I can. It's a bearded dragon. Somebody said Komodo dragon too. We're going to talk about a few different dragon possibilities, but this was the one I picked that we have at the St. Louis Zoo. And they don't breathe fire, but they do have a similarity because they open their mouths in this, like you see in this picture on the right, and they breathe out extra heat. They are reptiles and they're cold-blooded, so sometimes they have to sit in the sun to get warm. And if they start to get a little bit too warm, they'll open up their mouths and they'll breathe out a little bit of that extra heat. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second so we can all do that together. And bearded dragons also will kind of puff up their necks if they're threatened. And that's another way, that's why they're called bearded dragons. They puff them up and they get kind of dark, like that picture that you'll see again in a second. So we're going to pretend to be bearded dragons that are either threatened or they're getting too hot. We're going to open up our mouths wide and breathe out our heat. Okay, are you ready? 1, 2, 3. I can't help but stick out my tongue when I do that. I don't know about you guys. All right, let's do it one more time. 1, 2, 3. So they don't breathe fire, but they do breathe out that extra heat. And I think they look pretty cool and intimidating with those big beards that they have, like you can now see on the one on the right. So that is one of our dragon creatures. And they do have claws and they're reptiles with that scaly skin. And often they kind of have like little ridges along their sides or their backs like storybook dragons do, but they don't have wings. Now, I don't know if anybody has seen this creature before. It is a sea slug, which is kind of, you may not have even heard of before. Nudibranch is the other word, the fancy scientist word. Connor, maybe you could put that word up in the chat so people could see how it's spelled. But that's another word for sea slug. And this one is called the blue dragon sea slug because it's blue and it kind of looks like a dragon. And they float in the water and they actually float upside down. This blue side is their belly side. And it's all this bright color and it almost looks like they have wings with feathers on them. And a really cool thing about these blue dragon sea slugs is even though they can't breathe fire or venom, they actually do sting. They eat jellyfish and they can incorporate the stinging parts of the jellyfish into their own body. So they're kind of magical. They almost steal the jellyfish's abilities when they eat them so that when a predator touches them, it gets stung. And they can actually sting more than the jellyfish because if they eat a bunch of jellyfish, they have a bunch of stinging ability. So that's a really cool thing about them. So that's another choice for our dragon animals. And then our third choice is called a gliding or a flying lizard. The scientific name for these guys has Draco, which is another word for dragon in it, because a lot of people think they look like dragons. So these aren't technically wings stretched out at their sides. It's their ribs that they can expand with skin in between. And so then they can jump from tree to tree and kind of glide like a paper airplane or a hang glider. So they stretch those out so that they can catch the air and glide further between the trees because they live in trees. So they're another reptile and they have wings and they're called gliding lizards. So those are our dragon options today. All right, so now we're going to do our next poll and you guys have to decide or try to decide which you think is the most dragon-like of these three animals. And again, your choices when Connor puts up that poll are going to be the same as the order of these pictures. So the bearded dragon starts with B, is on the top, and I just put it as sea slug for the middle one. That starts with S, and gliding lizard, which starts with G, is the last option. All right, it looks like the bearded dragon won. I wonder if maybe lots of you guys want a dragon for a pet. And the sea slug came in second and the gliding lizard came in third. Somebody asked how big about one of the animals, but I don't know which one you were talking about. Maybe the sea slug, and they're actually really tiny. They're kind of about the size of a thumb. So they're itty bitty. So you don't have to worry too much about them if you see, and you wouldn't see them in the water around Missouri or usually even around America. But But they are really, really cool creatures, and you would want to steer clear if you saw them in the water. All right, so we are going to go on to another kind of fantastic creature, which are fairies. So these are some insects that resemble fairies. And if you're already thinking about the poll and which one you would choose, we're finished with our choices of animal polls. We'll do our enjoyment poll at the end, but I'm not going to quiz you on any of the other ones, so you don't have to choose anymore. But these are some fairy-like animals. So the ones on the left are called woolly aphids, or sometimes they're called fairy flies or flutterflies. And they have this waxy substance on their bodies. They're really, really tiny, but they put this waxy substance out that looks kind of like cotton balls, somebody said in the chat. That's exactly right. Or it looks kind of feathery, kind of like a fairy dress to me. And they're super tiny, like fairies often are in stories. You can see how tiny they are because the one on the top is on a leaf, and you can see how close up that leaf is. And the one on the bottom is actually on a pair of blue jeans. So that's how tiny that little creature is, that you can see the little like narrow strips of thread on the blue jeans. And then the one on the right is called a fairy wasp. It's even tinier. These are a kind of wasp that are the smallest flying insects in the whole world. And this picture is so blown up that these guys in real life are about the size of 2 or 3 hairs across. That's how tiny they are. And one of them has the scientific name Tinkerbella nana. So it's even named after a fairy, which I thought was pretty cool. And then they have these really nifty wings with their kind of fringy edges. I don't know if there's an animal part that wing reminds you of. There's something it totally reminds me of, but I don't know if everybody else feels the same way. It totally looks to me like a peacock feather, which I feel like is something a fairy might wear. So that's another fairy creature. All right. And next we have giants. So in storybooks, what does a giant look like? I mean, I'm sure everybody knows that they're big, but are they, big lizards? Are they big ants? They're usually big people, right? So their giant is just, yep, somebody said huge, right? Exactly. They're just a big version of a person. So the animals we're going to talk about now are just big versions of the same kind of animal. So on the left, and somebody said big, tough, two-legged, those are awesome answers. So on the left, we have a giant anteater, and these are all giant animals that you can see at the St. Louis Zoo. Giant anteaters are one of my favorites, and they are humongous. They're really, really long, and they have these big fluffy tails, and their tongues are a couple feet long and can stretch outside their mouths, and they're just much bigger than most anteaters are. And then this guy in the middle is called a giant marine toad. Oh, somebody said bullfrogs. They're pretty big too. This marine toad is even bigger than a bullfrog, so they're really giant. And then technically this tortoise doesn't have giant in its name. It's a Galapagos tortoise, but they are giant tortoises. And you can see from the orange in that picture just how big that tortoise is. So they are really, really, really big. But I'm going to tell you about a couple of my most interesting, I think, favorite giant animals. And one is a capybara, which we also have at the St. Louis Zoo. And have you guys ever heard of rodents? Can you think of any other animals that are rodents? If you want to, you can put them in the chat. And my picture here has a couple of hints. Somebody said rats. That's totally right. And I think somebody was still referring to giants like a basketball player. They definitely often are really tall people. But what are some other rodents you can think of? Mice, rats, perfect, hamsters, porcupines. Ooh, I think, I'm not 100% sure, Connor might know better than me, but I don't think porcupines are rodents, actually. But in this picture, we have to show you kind of the size of capybaras. If a mouse was this size and a squirrel, another rodent, was the size of the one in the middle, then a capybara in real life is that big. They're about 2 feet tall when they're standing on their 4 legs. So they're huge for a rodent, especially compared to a little field mouse or a shrew or something like that. And capybaras are really cool animals. Let me show you some pictures of our zoo ones right now. They actually live around a lot of water and they're great swimmers, which you don't necessarily think of rodents being. There are muskrats and things like that, and beavers, which are rodents too, are good swimmers, but capybaras are one of the good swimmers. Now, can you look at their bodies and see if there's anything you can think of with them that might adapt them for being in the water? What about their bodies is good for being in the water? You might want to look at their heads. Any guesses? And it's okay. This is a little bit of a tricky question. And somebody did say one of them is eating salad. Yep, that capybara looks like it likes kale. So if you want to be like a capybara, make sure you eat your kale when your family gives it to you. Their ears, yeah. So if you notice, their eyes, their ears, and their nose are all kind of on that one flat part of their head. So when they get down in the water, only that top part of their head has to be out for them to breathe and see and hear. So they can hide from predators in the water, and then most of them isn't visible at all. They can still breathe. And somebody said they have webbed feet. That is totally true. They're really interesting creatures. And like all rodents, they have to chew things a lot so that to wear down their teeth, because their teeth just keep growing and growing and growing. All right, now if anybody is afraid of bugs or spiders, I'm about to show some pictures. First, it's just going to be drawings, so you won't see any real spiders. I'll tell you before I show you the spiders. But it's important to remember that spiders are important in the world, and they usually really do not want to bother you. They are not interested in biting or eating people. They usually only do that when they're bothered biting people, and they're really, the vast majority of them are totally harmless and wouldn't hurt you. So tarantulas are a kind of giant spider. And this is another kind of fantastic creature that some people keep as pets. But again, you'd have to make sure that it was the right choice for you. And one thing to know about all these animals, if you find one in the wild, you wouldn't find a bearded dragon around you probably, but if you found a tarantula or something, don't try to keep it as a pet. Wild animals should stay in the wild, and animals that are born to be pets are the ones you should pick for a pet. So, all right, so a tarantula can be bigger than a grown-up hand, at least from the sides of its legs to the sides of its legs. So obviously that's a lot bigger than most spiders, which are pretty tiny. And there are lots of different kinds of tarantulas. We actually have 8 different kinds at the St. Louis Zoo. One of them is this Mexican red-kneed tarantula on the left, and that's one of the big tarantulas. And this one on the right actually is a Missouri tarantula. So I believe they're also called Texas tarantulas, but we do have them in Missouri. But this is a zoomed in picture. They're only like 3 or 4 inches, so smaller than my palm. And all tarantulas are venomous, but again, they don't want to bite people. They want to eat other insects, or even sometimes a frog or a bird. The bigger tarantulas do. They do not want to hurt you, so unless you bother them, they are going to leave you alone. And as far as I know, I believe I read somewhere that nobody has ever died from a tarantula bite or anything, so they're really unlikely to hurt you. All right, and we do have a bunch of dwarf animals at the zoo too. Dwarves are kind of the opposite of giants. They're very small versions of people, usually in stories. And these are smaller versions of some of the animals in the wild, like a dwarf caiman on the left. Oh, and somebody knows Bubbles. That's our dwarf zebu on the right. She's actually pretty big for a dwarf animal, but she is still a kind of zebu that's smaller than others, or that kind of zebu is smaller than others. So they're called dwarf zebus, but I put her in because she's kind of funny in that she's a big animal. And then the dwarf mongoose, another one of my favorites, is in the middle there. All right, I want to make sure that we have some time for questions, so I'm going to pull up the Q&A. I'm going to put up my acknowledgements while we talk about some questions that you guys might have. Oh, it looks like Connor answered all of our questions. So if anybody has any other questions, you are welcome to put them in still. Oh, somebody asked about whether the sea slugs sting jellyfish. That's a great question, but I think they probably sting other things that would try to eat them. But that's a really good question. And we don't always know all the answers. So you know, like I said, you can research things, or you can, on our last slide, you'll be able to see the website and email address where you can email more questions. Oh, and looks like we got one more question in. Ooh, what's my favorite mythological animal? Oh, that's a really good question. I totally should have thought up an answer for this before. I think it's probably dragons, just because I think it's really interesting what a wide variety of stories there are about them. In some stories, they're kind of the bad guys, and knights are trying to fight them. And then in other stories, they're actually really kind and helpful. And I really think that's neat that they have such a wide range. Oh, and what is the name of the first dwarf animal, somebody asked? That is a dwarf caiman. So it's a kind of crocodile, basically. And I know I kind of had to whiz by it because we're running out of time, but it's really pretty small. In the picture, there were leaves that were like almost as big as its head. So those, that's how small the dwarf caiman is. Oh, and what is my favorite fantasy book? Oh, that's another nearly impossible question. Let's see, ones for kids. Oh, I am totally blanking. If anybody has suggestions, throw them in the chat, because I know there are wonderful, wonderful fantasy stories. I don't know if it's good for, it would be good for some of your age. I think there's one called The Princess Black that I've heard really good things about, but I haven't read it, and but I want to. So, oh, and somebody said Harry Potter, definitely. There's some great ones. Perfect. Oh, and somebody, great job reminding me that I need to tell you guys about what's going on at the zoo right now. Somebody asked when we can come to the zoo. So the St. Louis Zoo is back open, and we do have lots of safety measures in place, like wearing masks and keeping distance from each other, and we're limiting the number of people that can come in, but it is still free, so you can get your reservations for free on the St. Louis website, St. Louis Zoo website. So you do have to reserve a spot, but there's no charge to it, so you can just go on there and reserve for your whole family and come visit us at the zoo. Ooh, how many animals live at the zoo? Molly asked. That's a really great question. Oh my gosh, hundreds. I don't even know the answer to that. Connor might know, and if he does, he could answer that, but I do not know the answer to that. And Sarah asked, are bearded dragons the biggest kind of lizard? Bearded dragons are actually pretty small. You can hold their body on the palm of your hand. So there are much bigger lizards like Komodo dragons and other creatures like that are a lot bigger. So bearded dragons are definitely not the biggest. And somebody suggested the Dragon Master series. And we're going to put up our enjoyment poll as well. So please do answer that, because we want to know if you guys enjoyed the program today. And thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us. And I hope those of you who are local to St. Louis can come visit the zoo and see all our animals soon. And if not, please check out all our virtual content on the St. Louis Zoo's website. We have lots of videos of projects you can do at home. Oh my gosh, I also totally forgot one more thing. I don't know if you can see my screen. I forgot to show you guys how to make a mythical creatures book. It's my craft for today. So I'll super quick in the last minute try to show you how to do it, and hopefully you can see it on my screen. I'm going to move this poll out of the way so that I can see. So you're going to take a notebook, preferably one with a spiral at the top because that holds it together better, and you're going to cut a few pages into 3 sections all the way to that spiral so that they move separately. Okay, and then you're going to draw a creature across. So on one side is going to be the head of the creature, the middle is going to be the body of the creature, and then the tail at the end. All right, and I'm going to show you some that I did. So I drew a duck head on this side, and then you want to kind of do them all so that they connect in the same spots, because we're going to mix them up later. So then you do the body in the middle and the tail on the third side, and then you do the same thing with your next animal. And what I do to make sure they connect is I just flip one section at a time. That way I make sure that my snake body can join up with my duck head and my duck tail. It doesn't have to be perfect, but then once you get that middle part, you can draw your other sides. So you can do what other kind of creatures you want and as many as you want, and then you can flip them to different spots and make sort of mixed up creatures. So I'm going to pull a different tail down. Sometimes in mythology, creatures are just made up of parts of all different real animals. So this one has a lion head and a dragonfly body and a duck tail. And then you can color them and make your own mythological creatures booklet. So sorry, I forgot to show you guys that. But thank you again for joining me, and I hope you all had a great time and have a great day.